After seeing mass commercial success as well as a lot of praises from the community, people calling this game of the year, I decided to check out Black Myth Wukong for myself. And while I do think this game is good overall, I do also feel that it might be slightly overrated. If you like the video and wish to see more content, please consider liking and subscribing to see more. So let's get into it. The first time I fired up Black Myth Wukong, one of the things that blew me away personally was the visuals. This game is absolutely gorgeous, not just from an artistic point of view, but from a technological point of view. The level of detail seen on all the characters, environments, lighting, all of which is absolutely beautiful, and it's just very, very great to look at. And more so than that, despite its technical prowess, the game is actually very much well optimized. I didn't experience any bugs or glitches in my playthrough, which is a good thing considering how games are released these days. However, despite how good the game looks, it does come at a cost. And the cost is that this game is very, very demanding. Even on my rig, in order to achieve 60 frames per second, I had to turn off ray tracing. And to give you an idea, my specs were a 3080 Ti and a 10700K CPU with 32 gigs of RAM. And if I turned ray tracing on, even at the lowest settings, I would get at maximum like 45 frames per second. So it is highly recommended that you play this game without ray tracing unless you have the best of the best hardware. That being said, as for how the game actually plays, well, overall, I felt the combat for this game is really, really good. Most people would sit there and say, oh, it looks like a Souls-like game. And while it does look like that from the outset, it really is more into an action game than it is a Souls game. So you're thinking Devil May Cry, you're thinking Ninja Gaiden, things of that nature. And what makes the combat good is that there is a lot of customization. There's a lot of spells, there's a lot of transformations, and there's just a lot of cool abilities that you can do that help really, really make your style of play feel differently. On top of this, as you get further along in the game and you unlock more and more armor sets, you can really, really, really do different builds. For example, one of the builds that's available to you, provided you have the armor, is you can poison yourself and mitigate poison damage that you take, but greatly increase the damage you deal simply because you're in a poison state. It's just one of the many examples of how you can build your character to make it different. But the best part about it is that you can respec at any time. You just have to visit a shrine and you can respec with no consequences, no penalties, no items required. You can infinitely respec as many times as you like, which really helps for experimentation where you can try something out. If you don't like it, you can easily undo it. No harm, no foul. In terms of the core gameplay, in terms of what you're doing, this game is basically a boss battle or a boss rush type of game. Yes, you do roam the world, and yes, you do fight regular enemies, but most of the time when you're in combat, you are fighting bosses. I don't know the total number of bosses that are in this game, but there is a lot. We're thinking like triple digits around there because the amount of bosses that you can fight in this game is insane. And people might look at this and say, well, is it challenging? Is it hard? A lot of comparisons have been made to the Souls games. And when it comes to the bosses and the challenges, a lot of it really depends on how much exploration you do in the game. Essentially, to give you an example, every chapter that the game has a chapter end boss. That boss is extremely difficult. However, each chapter also has a chapter side quest. If you complete that side quest, you will get an item that basically hard counters that chapter boss. So an example, the first boss of the chapter 1 end boss deals fire damage. But if you have the item from the side quest, you'll have an item that greatly reduces fire damage buildup and can cure you if you're burning. It's completely mitigating most of the damage that the boss can do, making it a lot easier. So how difficult this game can be is really dependent on how much exploration you do and how much side content. But even then, even if you don't explore, even if you want to beeline it, it's not as hard as a Souls game because it is not as punishing. And that is the appropriate word to describe it. Punishing. In a Souls game, when you die, you lose your currency and you have to go and collect it again. In Black Myth Wukong, that doesn't exist. You actually have two separate currencies. You have your traditional XP that will give you a skill point in which you'll use to upgrade your character. And then you have your will, which is your financial currency, which is what you use to buy items and upgrades and things of that nature. As opposed to a Souls game where they're both the same currency, where you share the same currency. That doesn't exist here. Furthermore, in a Souls game, typically your save point is quite some ways away from the boss, and you're relegated to finding a shortcut to get to that boss quickly to dodge enemies. Black Myth Wukong does a very good job of having your shrine right beside of a boss. So it's very forgiving in that way that once you find the shrine to the boss, which is pretty much right in front of the boss room, you die, you respawn back at the shrine, it's right there, you don't have to fight anybody. So the game is far less punishing than a Souls game, therefore making it far more accessible than a Souls game. Bear in mind that there is still no difficulty options in the game and that it is a set difficulty. Let's get into the actual controls of the game. Now, this is one of the games that I had minor issues with. So the overall control, when you control Wukong, most of it is good. It's responsible. It's responsive. Your attacks will attack appropriately. You'll dodge appropriately. Things of that nature. But the issue I had specifically is with item usage. Multiple times throughout my playthrough, when I would be hit with a debuff of some kind, I would try to use an item to cleanse the debuff. And yet, when I used the hotkey, multiple times it was irresponsive. Where I'm not getting hit, nothing is hitting me, I'm not even moving, and yet I pushed a button and he didn't react to it. And sometimes I'd have to push it 2 or 3 times to get him to use it. In turn, it's led to a few deaths because it took me out of my rhythm because I'm like, wait a minute, you're not debuffing yourself or removing the debuff after I've clearly inputted the items. So there is a little bit of issue in my experience when it came to item usage specifically. My attacks, jumps, dodges, all of that, using abilities was fine. Just the items was a little inconsistent. In terms of the game's overarching story. So the game, if you don't know, takes inspiration from the Chinese novelization Journey to the West. The game assumes you have knowledge of this. People who are Dragon Ball fans will catch some of the references because Dragon Ball itself is also inspired by Journey to the West. But if you go in not having any knowledge of the source material, the story might feel kind of empty, might kind of feel like it's just there. And that's just because you're missing a lot of the little nuances because the game assumes you have the prior knowledge of the novelization. So if you're looking for a deep, rich narrative to pull you along, unfortunately, that is not here. While I complained about a game like Stellar Blade having a weak narrative, that narrative was direct and easy for the player to follow. Here in Wukong, not so much. It really hinges on your experience and knowledge of the novelization to get the full value of the game's story. The other issue I want to talk about, and this has been brought up many times by different people, is the invisible walls. Many times throughout your exploration as you go through the world, you'll see an area like, oh, that's cool, let's go this way. And you can't. It's just an invisible wall. I don't know why they didn't just cover up the path with like a big rock or something to stop you so you just know you can't go that way. No, it looks like you can go that way, but you can't. And this even applies to some of the boss arenas where you're trying to dodge and you don't realize that you're at the end of the boss arena and you're hitting an invisible wall. I've also died a couple times because of that as well. So the invisible walls is probably the biggest detriment to my experience in the game overall, on top of the little control issues. And of course, for those who don't understand the story, that might be an issue as well. So is Black Myth Wukong Game of the Year? Not for me, it's not. Do I think the game is fantastic? I absolutely do think the game is fantastic. I just think it's a little overrated. If someone were to ask me which game do I think is better between this or Stellar Blade, I'd probably give the nod to Stellar Blade ever so slightly, mainly because it's just more direct. The story's more direct. I didn't have the control issues that I had in this game. And even though they're both great, I do highly recommend both games. I do think Black Myth Wukong is a little on the overrated side. It's still a great experience. I do think anyone who's a fan of action games should definitely check this game out. It's definitely really good to play. It's just, I do think personally it's a little overrated in my opinion. So overall, I'm giving Black Myth Wukong an 8.5 out of 10. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.